On this video, I would like to do a brief introduction to the book of Acts to sort of talk about the book and what it means in terms of a brief way of introducing the book. First of all, as we look at the title Acts is a fitting one for the book since the writer is seeking to follow the various acts or works of the apostles in the spread of the gospel from Jerusalem unto the uttermost parts of the world, and in the growth and development of the early church. This is what the writer is setting forth. As to the author, one examines both the external and internal evidence, and it seems that Luke is clearly the author of the book of Acts. Both external and internal evidence point to that. For example, the Muratorian fragment, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexander testify of Luke's authorship. And there's the we sections of Luke. Not only is there strong external evidence, but internal evidence is also to be considered in the question of authorship. In the we sections, it indicates that the writer who traveled along with Paul was probably Luke. Secondly, when one compares the we sections with the rest of the book, there is a similarity of style and language, which points to the fact of a single writer of the whole book. And also, there seems to be a marked use of medical terminology, and Luke was a medical doctor. So all of this seems to fit together as Luke as the author. Furthermore, it seems to be a part 2, a volume 2, because it begins of the former treatise have I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. Going back to Luke and what had happened there, and then continuing to show what was continuing to happen in the church and the growth of the church. In looking at the historical background to the book of Acts, it is summarized, I think, in a very good way by Thiessen in his New Testament introduction. He writes as follows: the book of Acts, like the four Gospels, grew out of some very definite situations in the early church. There was, first of all, the definite need for authoritative information concerning the activity of the leading apostles, Peter, John, and Paul, especially concerning Peter and Paul and the influential brother of Jesus, James. How were they related to each other in the spread of Christianity? Then there was also a need for showing that the Christian movement was one movement, whether believers were Jews, proselytes, Samaritans, Gentiles, or former followers of John the Baptist. Especially was it necessary to show how Jewish and Christian, or Jewish and Gentile believers, were related to each other in the church. And thirdly, there was need for setting Paul's experiences in his missionary labors, and especially in his arrest and imprisonment, in the right light. Was he a traitor to his people? and an apostate from the law, an impostor that was deserving all the opposition and persecution that he received. And finally, there was the need for showing that God bore witness with all the apostles, both by signs and wonders, and by manifold powers, and by the gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to his own will, thus authenticating the whole Christian movement and connecting it with the work of the risen Lord and the ascended Christ. The purpose of the book, the overall purpose in the mind of Luke for the book of Acts seems to be fulfilling or completing his previous work, that is, the Gospel of Luke, of what Jesus had begun to do and to teach, and was now continuing to do through the apostles and the early church. And this seems to be implied in Luke 1:1 and 2, where Luke writes these words, "The former treatise have I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to do and to teach, until the day in which he was taken up, after he, through the Holy Spirit, had given commandments unto the apostles whom he had chosen." In other words, from these words, Luke goes directly then into telling how the work of Christ was continued. With this overall objective in view of the author, Luke no doubt had a number of lesser purposes in mind as well. Certainly, he had in mind the necessity of giving a brief discussion of the geographical development of the church, which started at Jerusalem and reached out to Gentiles through Paul the Apostle. Involved within this is the transition from Jew to Gentile, from law to grace. Thus, it was one of Luke's purposes to set forth the development of the early church and its transition from one economy, I believe, to another.